All right, well, thank you very much to Phil and David. They've almost brought us back onto time, which is fantastic. So this is a short Q&A session. If you want to ask a question, pop your hand up and someone will come around with a microphone. But to get things rolling, I thought I might throw a first question to Phil and David. What do you think some of the major infrastructure is needed to cope with the predicted growth? What are some of the things that you think Melbourne and Victoria needs to look at? I mean, David, you spoke about affordable housing or providing housing for the homeless, which I think is an important thing. Is there?
Renee, I'm not sure that Melbourne needs a lot more in the way of infrastructure. I think we're incredibly blessed. Generally speaking, I think our cities are incredibly blessed. There is no question that, well, I don't think there's a question, that our cities in Australia are built on the presumption that fossil fuel will last forever and everybody should own a car and it's all designed around a car. That's changing. But otherwise, this question of equity in our cities, I think, is the one that I'm most interested in. So how do we maintain the ability for the cities not to become an enclave of the rich or the wealthy middle class as opposed to the rich? I think that's the big problem.
Great, thanks.
I'd probably have to agree with David. One of the things, though, we have, just the same as we have differences in government on planning opinion, we have differences in government on whether it be public transport or whether it be road, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. You need to keep working on both. We are blessed with our rail and tram networks. If anything, the rail network has suffered from a lack of investment, not on the rail itself, but on signalling and all those other things that make the rail network efficient. And if those sort of things get looked after and some of the little blockages in the system, the rail system will become much more efficient. The trams work extremely well, even though they get in the way a little bit. And the thing that is underutilised entirely in Melbourne are buses. Buses are just, everyone looks down their nose at buses, but buses are actually quite a great form of transport, as we see in Brisbane and Sydney.
We certainly take advantage of buses in Brisbane. All right, any questions out there? Lovely. Yes?
Hello, my name's Michael Machuzik. I'm a market analyst. I've done several jobs recently in Melbourne. I advise on new projects. David and Phil, thanks for your comments. David, you toned down my question statement a little bit because I believe in a lot of the things you're saying about middle ring and demand and more owner-occupiers and so forth. I'd like to challenge the notion, and I'm going to ask this to every speaker today if I can, this group, about this demand. Most demand isn't for high-rise. Most of it comes from investors. They live very far away. 1 in 10, if you look at the market overall, and I've checked every resale in the last 5 years across the major markets in Australia and in the city, find that only 1 in 10 are owner-occupiers. Might change on resale. Most of the investors come from China. Most lock them up. Increasingly, they don't pay their body corporate fees. From a local point of view, there isn't much demand. I think we're robbing the middle and outer suburbs of the attention it needs. So my question is, I question the demand side of things. I think this is flash in the pan, once off, and very dangerous in terms of what we're building, who may or may not occupy it, and we may be selling off the farm. I'd like your comments.
Thanks for the question. I disagree with you. My view is you're 100% right if we use a rear vision view of development in our cities, particularly Melbourne. I'll speak specifically to Melbourne. Melbourne has been a non-CBD investment environment, relatively modest ring, and then we just push to the fringes. And the fringes just get further and further from the city. The growth corridors get further and further from the centre of town. The green wedges that we have planned into Melbourne get redeveloped. To give them some credit, the administration has decided that that is an unsustainable model for the city. So we're either going to have to redevelop or develop a second city, maybe it's Geelong, maybe it's somewhere else, or we have to make our city work much harder. But if there are 100,000 people arriving in Melbourne every year who do not have accommodation net, then there has to be growth. And the growth can either go to the fringes, in which case it pushes out into land that is otherwise farming land or arable land or useful land or green wedges, or there has to be an increase in density in the city. You might be right. You might be 100% right that we're building stock that won't be occupied. Driving into the cities at night, I don't buy that argument looking at the lights that are on in towers. I know a recent report was done that said, look at all of these properties where there's no water going through the water meter, and when they actually did a review of that, the vast majority of those were car parks because they're separately titled in Melbourne, so The idea that that population growth is not happening is not something that I subscribe to. Whether we're overbuilding for a future population growth that won't happen or not is a significant risk, and it's why we're happy to leave the middle to the people that want to play that game, and we'll go and play and work in areas where we're dealing with owner-occupiers or investors that are interested in quality, and we'll do that in sort of 80 to 120 apartment complexes, turn them over relatively quickly and build quality into them.
Thanks. Phil, any comment? No? Any other questions? Yes?
So my question is about Swanson Square specifically and the people who are living in there, who I presume their parents or others are the purchasers. So we're concerned then about the impact this has on people like our children who then can't afford because of the price rise, but the international students are the people who are bringing life to the city. So if we think about 10 years ago, before we had a lot of international students in the city, we didn't have the life at night. So we have a kind of dilemma here, which is being played out, I think, in the media around questions that, it becomes quite racist. So I'm wondering if you can comment about that dilemma in terms of occupiers and what they bring to the city versus owners.
I agree with you that the argument becomes quickly racist, and that's very disappointing. So it's often now reported giant Malaysian developer X, huge Chinese investor Y. I mean, they're just a developer, they're just an investor. It doesn't really, there's no reason for the descriptor. We specifically designed Swanson Square to reflect the fact that it sits on the boundary between RMIT University and Melbourne University, and therefore inevitably is going to be occupied by students or perhaps postgraduates or others working on key worker scenarios in that location because it's quite close to that biomedical precinct of Parkville. Consequently, it had to be very affordable rental accommodation, and we knew it was going to be investor product. Those people bring in huge dynamism to that area, and the retailers and those providing the support to the public realm, the living room of the building, will get a huge benefit as a consequence of that. I don't have a problem with that. I have a problem with the idea that exactly that demographic applies everywhere. So that building, it averaged 54, 55 square metres average apartment size. That is a tenanted space. That's not going to be an owner-occupied building. We know that. It has a reason for being in that location. I don't think it has a reason for being in the western end of the city that's nowhere near a university and is simply trying to provide accommodation at the lowest possible investment quality. That's probably a bad answer to your question, but it's kind of the best I can get to it. That dynamism that comes from people living in the city fundamentally changes the city. And if we go back to Rob Adams and Postcode 3000, which was really the injection of residential into Melbourne, it's fundamentally improved and changed Melbourne. The question is, where do we set the dial on the amount of that residential accommodation we're prepared to accept at that sort of quality?
Okay, thank you. Probably got time for one final question.
Michael Macon, Brookfield Multiplex. I see Renee grimacing, I'll keep it short. 12,000 apartments projected in Phil's stats a year to 2051, no commercial floor space being built, would suggest that no new jobs or white-collar jobs being created to house, yet we're building accommodation, which suggests it's a remittance economy, but the money that's driving the creation of the accommodation is in fact probably coming from somewhere else rather than from a productive landscape that underpins a real economy. So it does raise some interesting questions, some of those stats, and would you be able to comment on that disparity?
There's no new commercial space at the moment, just because there isn't demand, but there will be again in the future. I guess a few things impact on that. Activity-based workspaces and the sort of refit of offices where the the square metres per head have reduced, so you get more people into the same floor plate, has reduced some of the demand. But there will be, one of our office precincts in Kilda Road is progressively being handed over to residential because it's a great green area. Those people will be moving either to Docklands or the CBD or somewhere else. So the commercial space will happen, but I think you're right. I don't think there's massive growth in employment or industry in white collar industry in Victoria. And there's actually a reduction in blue-collar type industries as well, as there is across the country in manufacturing. So the population growth is heading to service industries, to education, to the health and research precincts in the city, all of those sort of things. But the commercial will follow. It just goes in cycles. There's just none at the moment.
I'll just make one comment too. I think one of the things we're seeing in society is a fundamental shift to where people work. And whilst we talked about Swanson Square and its 536 apartments, largely designed for students, somewhere in that 536 is the next Atlassian, is the next Google. There's somebody working there, not living there, as a consequence of the fact that living, working, educating, growing, developing can all happen within an environment that is the city. It doesn't solve all of those problems, and obviously Melbourne has had huge office development opportunities, some of them frustratingly recently terminated, but the office sector is very low. We're not as downbeat about commercial office in Victoria as Phil might be, and perhaps we should have a chat later about a couple of things that are coming up. But yes, you're right. There is a disconnect at the minute between where is the population coming to and why, and where are they going to work, and I absolutely buy that at the minute. Yeah.
Lovely. All right, thank you. Look, we might wrap up there. If we could thank Phil and David the usual way. Thank you.